Augustine, or Saint Augustine, as devout Catholics would have it, is a curious figure to include in this run of literary figures. He was a very prolific writer. He wrote millions of words in his lifetime, mostly in the form of philosophy, theology. He wrote an awful lot of sermons, being a bishop. He wrote a lot of letters. He was very active in the organization and government of the early church. So he left a huge paper trail, as it were. Very little of it is read today in any popular sense. If you want to make it your project to go and read your way through Augustine, well, more power to you. But the most common works that we have, that we tend to turn to in contemporary society, outside of really specialized theology, breaks down to just a couple of works. Some relatively graspable philosophical works, philosophical, theological, what have you. Those are very distinct things in his realm, but I'm not going near there. One of the main offering that he has in that is this City of God, very dense. Brilliant work of political theory, if nothing else, and a terrific portrait of what life was like in his time and place, for a thinker of such magnitude. But what we have selected here is probably his most popular work, in terms of you don't have to be a philosopher, or you don't have to be a theologian to really delve into it and really draw an awful lot out of it, and that is the Confessions. The Confessions of St. Augustine are relatively, not terribly long. This includes a significant introduction, not tremendous, but you can get through it reasonably well. The work itself is known popularly as as one of the first autobiographies. Augustine, among many other things in the history of civilization, is generally credited with inventing a genre of autobiography. Not entirely, but he gets credit for it, so all right, fine. He wrote this not entirely as a form of self-expression. He did it more or less as a kind of saints' lives of himself. Saints' lives were popular stories of the time where they would pick individuals of particular spiritual merit and call them saints, and they would people would tell stories of and write stories of these people's lives and how they got to be saintly, and how, by extension, fellow believers could model their lives after these people and thus become saintly as well. And that was, by and large, the frame in which he seems to have been working, because it is the narrative, not so much of his day-to-day life, but a very carefully assembled, and in some portions probably even fictionalized, representationalized versions of his growing up towards a certain end, and that end was his conversion to the faith that he went on to promote so dramatically. So this was a sort of a subset of the Saints' Lives practice, where it was a conversion narrative. He had to show that he was on a wrong path early on, and at a certain point he saw the light, and dedicated his life from then on. And the story, as a story, does more or less track that, and it gives us a remarkable view of his life and the life of his times, which in themselves are very interesting, but also gives us a remarkably dramatic rendering of some of the philosophical conflicts that a man like Augustine was cracking his head against for his entire life. Significantly, his time was tumultuous. He was born roughly, 397 CE, and no, he was born in 354 CE, lived until around 430 CE. The Confessions were written when he was roughly 40 years old or so, between 397 and 400, 40 to 50. He wrote them in Latin. He was fluent in Latin. He was born and grew up in North Africa. That's where he spent most of his time. He is sometimes identified as Augustine of Hippo. Hippo is a city in North Africa where he served as bishop for several years, the most productive years of his life in terms of literary production. He was writing significantly at a time in the late Roman Empire. He began writing he lived through the late Roman Empire, and that's what he grew up in. And it was in the process of falling away. The legalization of Christianity had come down with the Edict of Milan by Constantine in 313, and it takes the Confessions picks up then in a time just a couple of generations later, when the organizing principle of Christianity for a long time was martyrdom, and because you could be killed for being a Christian by the Roman Empire, it was considered a threat to the government. But at this point, it was no longer a threat, and people were sort of looking around for, okay, if we are no longer the persecuted of the government, who are we? What do we believe in? And you start to see this remarkable fruition of belief systems and dogmas throughout the Christian world, particularly in North Africa, where he was, where it was just a little bit removed from the cultural centers of Rome, and Europe itself didn't really have much going on beyond Rome at this point. But there were a lot of beliefs popping up, and different people coming along and saying, well, okay, now that we can practice freely, we can start to explore. Let's take this faith out for a spin and see what it can do. And they were coming up with all these different versions of Catholicism or Christianity and spirituality in general. Religion was going through a remarkably fertile period, and it was extraordinarily tumultuous. A Christian struggle, then, if he was no longer being persecuted from without, a Christian struggle then had to be a reflection of something else. To define yourself as a Christian is to struggle against, you had to struggle against something. And if it's not the external persecution of the government, the struggle moves internal. People would have to define, well, what if nobody else is going to, persecute me, and I need to assert my beliefs in opposition to them? How do I assert my beliefs? How do I firm up any definition of what it means to be spiritual and in line with God in some way. And so you take away the external threat, and that need will manifest itself internally. And that's really where Augustine steps in. He does a remarkable job of creating internal struggle, kind of on his own, which, when you think about it, is largely what an autobiography is. It is a story of internal struggle more often than not. If it's a biography, you don't know what's going on inside, but a internal struggle, what's going on beneath the surface within your own mind and heart and soul, that is something that can only be narrated from within. And this is where Augustine really steps in and shines. He grew up in North Africa, and he was born into a family of some indeterminate number of brothers and sisters, a father who was not a Christian but had some money, enough so that Augustine could be educated, and a mother who was a Christian and had great hopes for her son. They both the mother and father had significant ambitions for Augustine, who showed early on that he's a smart kid. Let's invest in him. So they were able to gather enough money to send him to school, to get him an education, which was not by any means the common route in that time and place. But he showed a lot of promise. And through his education, he got to move on to Rome, where he furthered his education. He was on track to becoming essentially a lawyer. He was studying rhetoric and philosophy, and he was practicing to be a great rhetorician in government and the courts of law, where the ability to speak and write well were very highly valued, and his father especially seems to have had that aim singled out for him, that, okay, you're going to go and you're going to do this and you're going to be very successful. And he was going along with that. And he was on that track for quite a while. But then at a certain point, he was converted. He, over time, as this story, the Confessions, lays out, he was slowly drawn more and more into a religious vocation. And then once he had converted, he never really looked back, and he was offered a bishopric in North Africa. He had already moved back to North Africa. He was made a bishop, and he lived out his life essentially as one of the most formidable characters in the early church, and is often called a father of the church, because in those early times when Christianity was looking to define itself, he was willing to leap into the void and say, I'll define it for you. And people will note that he was writing just a couple hundred years after Christ himself had walked the earth. In terms of the stature of the church, it's basically him, and then like 800 years later, you get St. Thomas Aquinas, and those are the two guys who essentially created the modern church as it is, drawing from very distinct philosophical traditions. They had some interesting, to read them side by side. Thomas Aquinas and Augustine is sort of an interesting little dialogue that they have going over the span of several centuries, but they really laid down the foundation of the Catholic Church as it exists today. But in the middle of that Augustine sits down and he starts to write the Confessions. There's some evidence that it was the product of a period of some writer's block. Maybe he was just doing this as an exercise to free up his remarkably fecund vocabulary for philosophical work, for sermons, the ordinary communication demanded of bishops. For whatever reason, he started writing this, and he organized his thought about. He used it to organize a lot of his thought about the nature of God, the role of divinity in a human world, and the necessary practice of trying to negotiate between the two. He is, throughout the Confessions, a remarkably vulnerable and tortured individual who is always being torn between these two impulses, his human impulse and a pull of the divine. He was a very, very strong. He was very strongly influenced by the philosophy of the Greek philosopher Plato, more through his later interpreter, a guy named Plotinus, who came up with this, who was the main figure of what came to be known as Neoplatonism, where there is a sense of a abstract ideal to which we must all strive, and this fed into very, very neatly into early Catholic thought. The story itself, as he lays out his life, is really quite interesting, and the consistency of how he perceives it is it's very hard to read this and not be struck by the threads that he's always tugging at. This is not just somebody, journaling what he did on a given day. This is somebody who is very specifically laying out points and building a case for something. He's not very self-involved in this, believe it or not. For somebody with a considerable ego, I think it's fair to say, he sublimates any lax interest in self-reflection to a rigorous ambition to build an argument. Notably, he begins very early, and he talks about when he was a baby, and the evidence he has of that is sort of charming in its very humanity. He talks about how when later I began to smile. That's just adorable. I mean, come on, that's cute. First of all, who doesn't love babies? And second of all, it's cute. And he talks about how his recollections or his assumptions about when he was a child. And later I began to smile, first in sleep, then in waking. At least that is what I was told about myself, and I believe it, for this is what we see in infants, though I do not remember it about myself. So here he's sort of indulging in a little Aristotelian philosophy, and he is looking to nature. He can look in a bassinet and see, okay, that's a baby. What do they do? And just sort of sit there and study them for a minute. And he can draw out of that, okay, well, he does that, and it would make sense that since I've seen that baby do it, and I've seen other babies do it, it would make sense that I did that. And so he's building a little bit of an intellectual framework there. It might seem obvious, but it's a sign of a intellectualizing tendency and a focus on how do we explore humanity, not just from an outward perspective. He's trying to put himself into the point of view of that infant, and so he's trying to get inside the mind of that infant, and thus into his own mind as an infant. That's the key, trying to get into the interior perspective. And this is a sense of conflict for him. Gradually, I began to perceive where I was and to want and express my needs to those who could fulfill them, but I could not express them, for the needs were inside me. Again, this might seem obvious. When a kid screams, new parents are always going, I don't know what he wants. How do I get him to stop crying? That's a very normal thing. Every parent since the beginning of time has felt that. But here he's focusing in on this distinction between what is inside him and what is outside, and how to communicate between the two. And that is the point. In a very subtle little way, it just seems odd. Like, I was a baby. I couldn't say, I want more food. But he's keying in on that one little thing, and doing so deliberately, because he is sounding this note right at the beginning that this is what the entire work is going to be about. He talks about the acquisition of language by repeatedly hearing words as they were positioned in various sentences. I gradually connected them with the things they signified. The word signified kind of trips us off into different French theories of the last half century. We don't need to go there. But the point is, he's talking here about, in the original Latin at least, he is talking about the medium of communication, and how he's trying to link up an idea in his mind to something concrete out there in the world, that there is a communication between the ideal and something here. He has an idea of a word, which is not a solid thing, and he has an object that he can assign that word to, and create a communication between those two things. Ideal, reality, mundane, divine, whatever you want to call it. He's dwelling on this again and again and again. Significantly, in the learning about babies, he talks about how he learns about babies from watching them. He's very explicit about that, but also by asking women. He says in one version, actually I'm not sure it's in this excerpt, but in one version he says, you, meaning God, you have allowed men to discover these things about themselves by watching other babies, and also to learn much from what women have to tell. What women have to tell. Interesting. Why drop that note in there? What does that do? What does that suggest about what he's trying to do? He is no big feminist. He's not trying for, equality in that regard. But there is a note of women have something to offer in that little phrase. That that the women's role, the traditional women's role of raising children, bearing and raising children, is something that should be attended to. That there is some value there, and we should not just ignore it or take it for granted. So that little note, he's just placing it there, and he's going to come back to it later on, and he's just laying the predicate for a case he's trying to build. But he narrates the story of his growing up. through various little stages of childhood, which in a very quick succession. He's not spending an awful lot of time on any particular age. It moves along pretty quickly. He grows up. It's a speed read. Uh, but significantly, this is about a process of becoming. He is growing up. He is developing towards something. And that is what he's trying to say here. He's physically growing up, he is mentally growing up, he's emotionally growing up, and he is spiritually growing up. And along the way, he's going to take little wrong turns and diversions and slow down and have all of these impediments. But it is a sense of progress, a sense of moving forward towards a goal. And that goal ultimately is where it's what he's keeping in his mind the entire time. The talking about his early schooling is particularly charming. Is there anyone, so Lord, any mind so great, so close to you in powerful love? Is there anyone, I ask, so close to you in piety and magnanimous love that he will think lightly, and not because his wits are dull, of the racks and hooks and other torments that men in this world pray to you with such dread to escape, but who mock the torments they so bitterly fear, just as our parents mocked the torments our tutors inflicted on us as boys? So he's comparing, rightly or wrongly, going to school with racks and hooks, torture, physical torture. Now, it is not unreasonable to assume that there was some corporal punishment, some beatings involved in school at that time. It probably was very unpleasant in a way that dwarfs the unpleasantness of kids who get off the school bus today and, oh, I don't want to go to school anymore. But that refrain of, the boys who don't want to study, who don't want to do their work, who are lining up against their teachers and feel like they are oppressed by their tutors, their teachers. They just don't want to sit there, I want to go out and play. I don't want to study. That is very identifiable. Everyone can understand that. At the time, again, schooling, education in any form was very, very restricted to a very narrow demographic. But as this book speaks through the centuries, more and more people can come to that and say, yeah, I remember that. I hated my teacher. I just couldn't stand. I just wanted to go out and play ball. I didn't want to sit there and, read this stuff and practice writing and doing all this garbage. It's universal. And this is, I think, the audience he was writing to, because by the time he was writing the Confessions, he was very well established, and he knew many scholars will tell you that he had a sense of the audience he was speaking to centuries and millennia ahead of him. And he was writing deliberately to them. So here, I can see that he's sort of sidling up to us and saying, we've all been there. We all hated school when we were young. And it works. It brings us all together. It gives us something to identify with, and we're invested in him from this point, I would say. The bit about the babies is cute, but this really puts us on his side in a way that, yeah, right, I remember that. Because it's charming. It is also, however, I would be remiss if I did not point out the unfun part of it, a sense of the authoritarianism and the rejection of it. He is, Augustine's philosophy gets accused an awful lot these days of being very authoritarian and clamping down on free will. That individuals are inherently depraved and need to be sublimated to divine authority. And through, well, needs to be controlled through many different levels of authority. Divine being the top one of them all. But he comes to dwell on situations like this again and again, where he is concerned with human freedom, with how much agency human beings are really allowed in any construction. Now, this particular excerpt in this anthology does not really capture what a lot of the early, I would say, well, it cuts out an awful lot, quite frankly. That doesn't necessarily move the plot along, but I think is a huge component of its context, and that is the prayerful language that he is using throughout. There are like whole chapters, excuse me, that are just devoted to praising God and singing to Him. This is a confession in the Catholic sense of being a confession to God in many ways. He is confessing all of his sins over his lifetime to God, and he is constantly refrained. And you've heard a little bit of what I read right there. He's always addressing you. He is addressing God. God is you. That's why it's always capitalized. You did this. You did that. You heard this. You maybe do that. And there's always this huge tension of, while he is describing unpleasant parts of his life, he talks about, he's talking about his tutors torturing him, beating him, but he always puts it in terms of, but you, God, you have the authority. You did this. This is your world. And he always says it's everything you do, you are all right. You are all good. You are in control of everything. I just don't understand perhaps the broader picture of things, which is very Job-like. He is always twisted on that question of how God can be all powerful and all authority, but still allow so much suffering in the world. He dwells quite often on themes. He's quoting an awful lot of scripture throughout, also, and some of that doesn't always come through in this particular edition. But he is particularly consumed with the story of Adam and Eve, the early Genesis chapters, which deal with primarily the role of evil in the world and how much freedom can humans have functioning within that, and is there any reason for human beings to have that freedom? And any reading of Genesis will tell you that there is a kind of a conflict between human freedom and divine power. Did Adam and Eve bite that apple because they were, created to by God? Was that part of God's plan? Well, then why was he so outraged when he came back, and why did he have to be told that they had done that? Was this an act of defiance of God? Well, does that really make sense? How could they defy God when he was everything that they knew? Who put the serpent in the tree to begin with? All of these things. Where is evil? Is evil something separate from God or part of God? These are questions that just consume Augustine in the most elemental ways throughout his life. And they pop up throughout the text in just minor little ways, sometimes more explicitly, but in little ways like this. Yet even in childhood, when my family feared less for me than in my youth, I did not like to study and hated being forced to, but I was forced, and it was good for me. So he's grateful for the authority. He is grateful for the lack of freedom that he had. Curious. What was good came to me from you, my God, for they did not consider how I should later use what they forced me to learn. Giving it all back to God, but you can tell just by his dwelling on this, there is something in the repetition of the way he dwells on these questions, the way he's always coming back to them, that suggests that maybe they're not so settled in his mind. He will put on a very big show here of saying, but it was all for my own good, God. You were right to have me suffer like that. I just didn't understand. The first time he says it, okay, maybe you believe him. The second time he says it, maybe, yeah, sure, he's still sincere. But he keeps coming back to this refrain throughout, in different contexts, always saying, but you, God, you were right. But then why does he keep writing that scene? Why does he keep writing that refrain? Why does he reinterpret every action in his life along this crux of how much authority God has and how much human freedom really matters? He's always dwelling on it, and you don't bring something up repeatedly if it's settled in your mind. You just don't. Oh. Where was I? How far? This is my page 52 in the novel. It is book 2, chapter 4. It's book 1. Yeah, book 2, chapter 4. Where was I? How far was I exiled from the delights of your house in that 16th year of the age of my flesh? The madness of lust raised its scepter over me, and I had relinquished myself to it entirely, condoned as it was by the turpitude of man, yet forbidden by your laws. Meanwhile, my family did not seek through marriage to keep me from plunging into the abyss, only their concern that I should learn to excel in discourse and be persuasive as an orator. He's 16, and he is, as 16-year-old boys, concerned with something very different than studying. He does not really care about being an orator. He is walking around just consumed with lust. The 16th year of the age of my flesh. He's very recognizable again. He's very human here. He's very open about admitting that, yeah, I'm not going to go into that, but you get the sense that he is a inordinately passionate person. He's not just saying, well, yeah, I like girls, sure, great. He's somebody who really feels quite passionately about these things. He has this great physicality to him. And it is all consuming in this characterization that he himself makes. But significantly, I would say, he's not just a horny teenager. He is, in his nature, very human, remarkably human, and very social also. He is not particularly abstract. At first, his thoughts are wide-ranging, but he likes humanity, and he is always he's always around friends. It is very rare that you can say that he was ever really alone. In fact, when at one giant moment he says he went off somewhere alone, and you know something big is coming, because at every other juncture he's always surrounded by friends. One of the primary religious moves of the day, religious practices, was a kind of was being a hermit, essentially practicing asceticism. People in North Africa, especially, would devote themselves to God by moving out alone in the desert and living in, essentially very austere conditions. Not eating much, going days and days and days without water, even enduring physical punishments to try and shed physical concerns for themselves and live in a kind of divine ecstasy. And he never does that. He has no interest in doing that. He is a social being. He likes to be around people. The only time that he talks about in the Confessions that are in this excerpt is when he and some friends of his, already living in Rome, in the capital city of the Western world, um, decide that, okay, we're going to go off together and set up a kind of a hermitage for ourselves, the group of us. And it's basically like, a bunch of guys who were, a fraternity going out and getting a fraternity house. It's more serious than that. They're not going out to play beer pong, but they're going in a group to practice worship, because that's really the only kind that Augustine can really imagine. He is very much of this world in that he is so connected to it, to other people. And that, again, is something that's really quite charming about him, but it's something that you need to keep an eye on, because it is almost at war with his straining after the ideal. He can't necessarily be divine and a good buddy at the same time in his own mind. He knows that there is an essential conflict there, and he tries to correct it, but you can see him struggling with it, just like he's struggling with lustful influences or lustful impulses throughout his life. He is trying to find a way to bridge this gap between his instincts for the divine and his instincts for the human. And he can't really let either one of them go. When he was a young man, still, he was hanging out. Well, teenager. When he was hanging out, he had a famous incident of going with some friends and essentially vandalizing a pear orchard. This was the big sin of his youth that he is recalling. Now, this is a confession to God. Conceivably, God knows everything that that Augustine did when he was younger. It's also a public confession, because he was writing this for other people. So when you're writing as a bishop, maybe you're cleaning up your act a little bit. But he takes this one seemingly trifling incident where some friends of his hopped a fence or something into a pear orchard, stole a bunch of pears, and then really just threw them away. In a minor little prank. Stupid juvenile delinquents. But he invests it with so much more. He dwells on it, and it seems strange. It seems like, well, proportionality. What are you so concerned about? But he's recalling this moment, I think, in very specific terms. First of all, the stealing of the fruit. No one can read that without immediately thinking of the analog of Eden and the stealing of the fruit. Again, Adam and Eve, Genesis, the burden of evil in a divine world. It's just a little note that is always bubbling under the surface. But he takes it and he goes in a slightly more abstract direction for a while there, where he talks about it as terms of what really confused him about it. What he found really frustrating was not just that they had stolen the fruit, which he probably would have admitted was, trifling, but that they had stolen the fruit and reveled in the action for itself. The evil was the goal. It wasn't the fruit. They threw most of the fruit away. They didn't really care about what they were stealing. They just liked stealing itself, the act of the sin, and that's what he dwells on and finds particularly abhorrent, because that's what can be replicated. The love of sin can take many different forms, certainly more serious than the pear tree. And this is what I think is significant in this. The the sketching of this scenario around the stealing of fruit and the investment of it with all of this heavy philosophical and theological underpinning suggests that this is not necessarily a autobiographical account, that this is all a metaphor, that we are dealing here not with something that, if we go back to police records from the year 1355 or whatever it is, or 355, I don't think we're going to come up with, Farmer Josiah complained about somebody breaking into his pear orchard one day. I don't think that this necessarily ever really happened. I think he is reconstructing in his mind a theory of sin that he's just dressing up in very Edenic clothes to try and make the broader point. So it's not necessarily a truthful autobiography so much as a interpretive memoir, if you will, where he's feeling free to create stuff. I don't have any evidence of this, obviously. This is just how I read it. When he goes on to school more, he succeeds very much there. While he is a student, he is actually quite successful at being at his studies, and also he seems to be rather popular for his studies. People were acknowledging him for his brilliance. It's cool to be the smart kid in class. No. He starts to see, however, that this itself is a kind of sin, or he interprets it, because what he sees is pride, and he sees it as in opposition to the true joy that is in God. I came to Carthage and was immersed in a seething cauldron of illicit loves. I had not yet loved, but was burning to experience love and consumed by an inner craving, and was vexed at myself for not craving more. He's gone to the big city for the first time, and let's go out. But curiously, again, was vexed at myself for not craving more. You can see he's not craving more. He's also there to go to school. He's there to study. He's there to learn, and he feels this somewhat divided nature in himself. He wants to go out and party, but he also wants to stay and be a serious student because he is a genius, and he's trying to assert that part of himself, and through that genius to achieve a kind of elevation that would mirror, if not reflect, a religious ascension. In love with love, I sought an object of love, but shunned a path that had no snares. I was consumed by hunger, deprived of inner food. Inner. There's that word, inner food. Inner. The interior. Inner food deprived of you, my God, and yet it was not for you that I hungered. I lacked all desire for incorruptible sustenance, and because I was sated with it, but the emptier I was, the more I disdained it. And so my soul sickened and covered with pustules gushed forth, wretchedly striving to be soothed by sensual objects. He is a phenomenal writer, and there's some pretty purple stuff in here. Some very lush language. He seems almost in a kind of ecstasy at times when he's writing about it, in a kind of religious, spiritual ecstasy, but also almost a very physical ecstasy. Um, and he can convey this in language. And I think, honestly, sometimes language gets the better of him. To love and be loved was all the sweeter to me if I could delight in the body of the beloved. He's out of town having some fun. So I sullied the clear spring of friendship with the filth of carnality, dulling its brightness with infernal lust. And though I was base and vile in my vanity, I paraded myself as refined and urbane. Yeah, the first time he's, away from home and he is sowing some oats and he's feeling good about himself. Yes, hey, I have sex all the time. I'm very sophisticated. Um, he can dwell in the disgusting and prurient view of it now, the filth of carnality. But at the time, he was probably really quite enjoying himself. Um, and it wasn't all just, purely going to orgies every night. Chapter 2, I was captivated by theatrical spectacles filled with images of my miseries, which poured fuel on my fire. And he talks about like the role of theater in lives. Captivated by theatrical spectacles. He liked going to the theater. Well, who doesn't? And this is a great sin in his life. I guess in certain traditions, perhaps. So maybe he's exaggerating the level of evil in which he is practicing. I'm not sure, but it's awkward. You can see in book 5 when he leaves Carthage to go to Rome. He's been called, he has an opportunity to go to Rome to continue his studies, to teach some more. He's moving up in the world. Rome, if you want to be basically he is still on that lawyerly track. And if you want to be in that world, you got to go to the capital. That's where it's all happening. And in Carthage even, I mean, it's the big city of the Styx. It's, it's way off the map as far as the late Roman Empire was concerned. So he needed to come to where it was all happening, the room where it happened, But you can see again, like this curious strain of authoritarianism sneaking in. Almost my only reason was that I had heard that young men studied there more peaceably and were subjected to more rigorous discipline, not all rushing wildly into the class of a master whose pupils they were not. Somewhat censorious here. He is outraged that other students are somewhat rowdy in the provinces where he's grown up, and he wants to go where, we want to have more discipline. We don't want those ruffians around. Oddly concerned with behavior here, and for somebody who is so concerned and so dramatizing of his own moral lapses, he seems oddly judgmental here. He is irritated always by disorder. You see this again and again and again. He gets very agitated if things are out of place. He was clearly like a very OCD guy, and he's always demanding in terms of behavior. People exercise restraint. He is upset that these ruffians, as he's calling them here, are coming in and being very boisterous when they should be restraining themselves. And here we're going back to, when he was a little boy and his tutors were restraining him. Well, what is the role for that restraint? Should the restraint be internal, as he's saying that these guys should have, or should it be external, when he was saying that, the tutors were perhaps a little too heavy-handed with him? But in that case, is God's restraint internal or external? Does he cause you to be restrained, or is he restraining you from outside? Internal, external, free will versus divine omnipotence, these things are always, always, always bubbling up. He leaves. Basically, he ditches his mom on the shore. His mom comes with him, and she's concerned about him going to Rome. She's been keeping an eye on him, and she's trying to raise him to be to be a good Christian. And she is very concerned about some of his errant capacities. And she's a mom, and I think we can all understand that. She worries about even her grown-up children, that they're maybe not making the best choices in the world. And she follows him, and he focuses on their relationship very clearly in this little moment, and it's sort of heartbreaking. But it's curious also that he is recalling it and including it in this manuscript, because it is very personal, and I'm unsure why he's including it. I have a thought, but it's uncertain why he's focusing on that. He says, she clung to me in desperation, seeking either to keep me there or to come with me. But I deceived her, pretending that I had a friend I was seeing off with whom I had to wait until he had a good wind to sail. I lied to my mother, lied to such a mother, and so escaped. So he breaks off from her, and then he secretly sets sail without her from North Africa over to Italy. It's a short hop across the Mediterranean. But that night I secretly departed without her. This seems to be nagging at him. He's coming back to it again and again. He's not necessarily making that big of a deal about it, but again, every little time he mentions something, you gotta wonder, why? What's going on? And you get a sense of, this is really bothering him on the inside. His interior struggle is playing out through the words, and all we have to go on are the words on the page. That's the exterior. We're seeing his behavior and his words, but we're trying to get a sense of the interior life going on within him. And these little hints are suggesting that maybe he feels really bad about ditching his mom. Anyway, he goes to Italy. He starts talking about his friends. He's always around his friends. He talks about his common law wife. He picks up he has been involved with this woman for quite some time, dating back to Africa. She follows him to Italy. I think he was around 17 when they started. And in fact, she bears him a son. And clearly, this is a long-term relationship. It's been going on for many years at this point. And, she's just devotedly following him. He doesn't necessarily, it's a little unclear, but he doesn't necessarily seem to see it as a monogamous relationship. In the meantime, my sins were multiplying, and when the woman with whom I shared my bed was torn from my side for being an impediment to my marriage, My heart that clung to her was rent and bled. She returned to Africa, vowing before you never to know any other man. He had an arranged marriage. His he had it set up that he was going to get married. This woman with whom he was living for many years and had the son with was evidently considered unsuitable. So he had to break it off. And he went to her and said, okay, uh, sorry, can't do it. He was engaged to a young girl, literally. I think the footnote here says that she would, the girl was considered too young for marriage. Girls usually got married around 12 or 13 in the late Roman Empire, so too young for that. We're figuring, they said that they had to wait like 2 years, so you got to figure, all right, she was around 10. That's the impending bride to be. But this was normal. This is the custom. Okay, fine. Augustine goes into that and he agrees. All right, fine. We will get married. We will wait for 2 years before we make it official. And he goes out and he meets another woman and starts shacking up with her. And I procured myself another woman, though not a wife, for I was not a lover of marriage, but a slave to lust. I love that. Marriage is good. But he's clearly not on the heavenly path at this point. He's not really. It's not obvious that he's going to be a bishop at this point. But still, he feels this draw, and while he's in Rome, he's with his friends. Most of them are also, very devout in their own ways, and they're practicing or they're worshiping together, and he's slowly evolving towards that. He gets diverted for a little while into a belief system that began with him in North Africa called Manichaeism, which is a belief in, it's very complicated, but it's a belief in essentially the world is divided into equal parts good and bad, and it's complicated. That God is himself a kind of equally evil character. We don't need to go into all of that. It is fed through his Neoplatonist philosophies, and he really struggles to try and reconcile that. But over time, he's having trouble with that. It is intellectually inconsistent with what he is, with the conclusions he's drawing now, and so they start to fall away. He rejects Manichaeism, which is not quite yet full-blown devoting himself to God in the burgeoning Catholic way, largely because he feels so torn about it. And he is still going out and having a lot of fun. He is still ambitious. He still loves being the smartest guy in school and or the smartest guy in town at this point. He's getting quite a reputation. His life is good. He enjoys being around people. He enjoys the physicality of it. He enjoys his friends. And obviously he enjoys his women. One of the most famous quote really from this work that for some reason is not in this this excerpt is that when he prays, the whole thing is a prayer. But when he says, addressing God directly, he says, make me continent and chaste, my Lord, but not yet. Continent means contain, meaning not technically it means not leaking bodily fluids. In today's vernacular, it tends to mean like incontinence is what happens when you have to wear diapers. Whether you're a child or an older person, incontinence is a problem with people as they get older. But it also, quite frankly and obviously, has a sense of incontinence, the leaking of other bodily fluids. So continence to him means celibacy, essentially. And that little phrase, make me continent and chaste, Lord, but not yet. The ambition for the ideal, for participating in divinity, for being perfect in some way, and being able to touch the perfection of God. What's the rush? Leave it. In the future, we'll get there. Fine. Yeah, just give me a little bit more time. I'm young. I'm strong. I'm not that bad looking yet. Let me go out and have some fun. And then, down the line, I'll get a little bit tired and retire, and I'll like to go to sleep early. And who's got the energy for that after a while? Oi, oi, oi. Yeah, sure. Now I'll be chaste. Celibacy is much easier when you're older. He's at that stage now where he feels really torn between these impulses: the impulse to be godlike and perfect, and the impulse to be human and flawed. And where you fall on that spectrum is a big part of who you are as a human being. And he is struggling with that because he wants to go in that direction, but he feels dragged down to the in the other way. And that sense of being torn, constant, it's pulling at him. It's just ripping him apart. He goes with a friend to a little garden. And his friend Alypius, who has a much bigger role in the full work. Very interesting character on his own. But he's struggling with this. I know I should go in that direction. I just don't know if I can do it. I'm too in love with humanity, with the physicality of humanity, and I just don't know if I can make that leap. And he, very dramatically, in this moment, in this little garden, he tells Alypius, give me some space. And he goes off on his own. And this is significant because he just doesn't do that very often. He likes having people around him at all times. But he goes over from hidden depths, interior. A profound introspection had gathered together and amassed all my misery before my heart's eye. Heart, interior. And now a violent tempest arose within me, bringing a mighty shower of tears, and I got up and hastened away from Alypius so that my storm could gush forth with all its sounds and voices. Solitude seemed to me more fit for weeping. There's almost something ravishing about this description, like he is being honestly, sexually assaulted by divinity. He is just being ravished at this moment with this flood of emotions, and there is a victimization here. There is a denial of agency here, where he is putting it all on God to be flooding him with all of these gushing emotions and feelings, and he's crying, and there's an awful lot going on here that is Um, but he goes off and he's quiet for a moment in this garden, and he hears a song. He hears kids playing like on the other side of a wall, and they're singing. Here, the translation is pick up and read, pick up and read, which in Latin is tolle lege, which tolle lege sounds like something kids would say, a little sing-songy rhyme, tolle lege, little basic rhythm to it. You can see him playing all sorts of games to something like that. It could be interpreted any different number of ways. That could be just nonsense sounds that they were making or singing some other little song. It doesn't necessarily mean this, but it's what he interprets it to be. It's what it means to him. He hears, pick it up and read. So he runs and he picks up a Bible and he opens it up and he sees a passage, and it shakes him. And this is a great revelation to him. And right there is his conversion. He decides on the spot, okay, I'm a Christian now. Put aside all that other stuff. I am now going to be chaste and continent, and I am going to devote my life to God. This is a great relief to his friends. It's a great relief to him. He breaks it off with the 10-year-old. Presumably breaks it off with the not 10-year-old. He is starting on his new vocation, and this story doesn't quite end there. He goes and he narrates in book 9 the passing of his mother, and she has come to Italy with him now to be with him, and she's very excited that her son has, finally decided to give himself over to Christ as she has always wanted, and all of this, and she is now a widow. And we get a couple of nice little scenes with her there, all told very much from his point of view. But you get this sense of this really extraordinary character, and we learn more about her. And we learn about how when she was a little girl, she had been it was her job as a little girl to bring wine to her parents or something, and she would go and she would take a little sip before she brought the wine bottle or something, and this became habitual until one of the family servants made a snarky remark about it, saying, you're a little lush or something like that. Now, I don't know how old she was there, but the comment by the servant apparently inspired her to give up drinking entirely, even though, how, I don't know. I don't know how old she was. I don't know how much of a habit it was, but she gave it up entirely right then. And Augustine tells this story and credits it again to the divine care that God gives to bringing us all to the right path. So he singles out this little moment as an example of God guiding humanity and his special charges. And he's clearly singling out his mother in this tiny little anecdote as almost another saints' lives type of narrative. Even though, it's a little troubling that this servant didn't necessarily come to her and say, well, what you're doing is not good for you, and it's bad for so many reasons, and you should really think about this. No, she made fun of her. She ridiculed her. Was God acting through ridicule? Is this a sign of God's love that he, ridicules a little girl? It's a somewhat troubling little characterization. Um, but again, you get this sense of, well, authority. Good. It's troubling. Um, we learn more about her life with her husband, and how he had been physically abusive. Um, and that was, in fact, the norm in their little society, in their town. And Augustine says it became very accustomed to seeing the other wives around town with bruises all over their faces. And but Monica, his mom, we'll get to that, didn't necessarily always have them, because she learned to deal with her husband. Her husband would get into certain drunken rages, it sounds like. He was a very passionate man, kind of like his son, perhaps. Very enthusiastic at times, very passionate, very emotional, and sometimes that would get carried away and manifest itself in, evidently, some self destructive and violent behavior. But she learned to control that. She wouldn't fight him. She wouldn't get in his face. She would just accept it. She would submit. She would go along and let him play it out. And then, it's not that hard to see the relationship of many people in alcoholic relationships or families, where you just let them sputter it out, and then you go to them, when they're either too tired or suddenly sober, and you talk to them then, but you just let the storm pass. And that's what she seems to be doing here. And again, you see this sort of relationship of the individual submitting to, in this case, a kind of tyrant, a kind of brutal authority, and just accepting it and going along and not rejecting it, which is a really troubling characterization of the question of authority throughout. But Augustine and his mom go to Ostia, a little town at the mouth of the Tiber, and they're waiting. They're going to catch a boat back to North Africa, and she's very old at this point, and she is frail. But she's been living with Augustine and his friends and helping take care of them. She's sort of the house mom, and they have a very nice time together. And the two of them start talking about how she says, I don't know what I'm doing here anymore. I'm ready. I'm done. I have no interest in earthly things anymore. And Augustine and one of his brothers argue with her a little bit and say, well, don't you want to go back to North Africa? You can be buried with your husband. We got a nice little plot chosen for you right next to his. And not interested, really. It's irrelevant. Do what you want with this body. Sort of objectifies it, this body. And they start talking about fairly abstract notions of theology. And when in our conversation we reach the conclusion that the greatest delight of the bodily senses, the greatest corporeal delight, is not worthy of comparison to the sweetness of the eternal life of saints, not worthy even of mention, we were lifted with a greater glowing love towards God, the self-same. This is all deeply Neoplatonic. The denigration and, lack of interest in the body, in the physical, in the mundane, and the actual, versus the ideal, the divine, the spiritual, something, the body is ugly and weighs you down, and divinity is where you want to go. So if the body is weighing you down, you have trouble ascending to the divine. And that's where they go right next. We rose by degrees past everything corporeal to the very to the very heaven where sun and moon and stars shine upon the earth, and ascended even higher with our thoughts and words, with our marveling at your works, reaching these in our minds and transcending them, coming to that region of unceasing plenty where you feed Israel in eternity with the food of truth, which is a version of divinity as a kind of ladder. You ascend to heaven. It is you are weighted down by your body and your sins. And honestly, in 1,000 years, the Italian poet Dante is going to take this and say, "That's it, up and down. Sin makes you heavy, and you sink." Shedding the sin, and the closer you get to God, the lighter you become, and you drift upwards towards God. These manifestations of the philosophy are starting to really take hold. You get this very deeply Christian, Neoplatonic Christian anti-materialism. When she says, take this body, do with it whatever you want. I don't care about the grave. Just, toss me out anywhere. That is a denigration of the body. She says, God is everywhere, so what does it matter where I'm going to be or where this body is going to be? My soul will be with God. And she dies. She passes away. And you get this long meditation on her afterwards. Then on the 9th day of her illness, in the 56th year of her life, and the 33rd year of mine, not a long lifespan in that time, that pious and religious soul was freed from her body. Again, very Neoplatonic. The body is a prison. I closed her eyes, and pouring into my heart was a vast sorrow that overflowed with tears through my struggle under the strict command of my mind, redrank the fountain dry, the struggle causing great strife within me. Again, this war between, the vast sorrow was pouring into his heart, so it was coming from the outside, inside. You have the struggle between, my eyes under the strict control of my mind redrank the fountain dry. His emotions and his thoughts are at war with one another. He is trying to maintain a certain philosophical perspective in this, but still, it's his mother, and clearly this is the most important person in his life at this point. His most concrete image of connection to this world, and she's gone. And this is shattering to him. He has always dwelled on this image of his mother as a kind of divine figure. And in fact, in the very beginning of the book, he talks about breastfeeding. And he says very specifically that, it wasn't my mom or my nurses who were doing that necessarily, but it was you, God, who gave them the capacity to feed me and to nourish me with the milk that you create, because you are the author of all. So he sees his mother as a kind of vessel of divinity that has been in his life throughout, and now she's gone. And it is just earth-shattering to him. And despite all of the denigration of the body, and despite all the lack of interest in personal identity. She doesn't care about a grave. She doesn't care about a monument. She doesn't care about any of that stuff. She just says, my soul will be freed and will go wander around with God. Despite all of that, she is allowed a kind of identity in these last chapters of the book that is remarkable. First of all, she is named. She is given a name. We don't get a lot of names throughout here. We don't know the name of the woman who bore his son. We know the names of a couple of his friends. We know the name of his son, Adeodatus. Uh, but a lot of the other names, people just drift in and out, and you get a sense of them. At times he's talking about his brothers when he's talking to his mom at the end in Ostia. He says that he was with one of his brothers, and it's unclear whether or not he meant brothers as in one of his friends whom he saw like they had a fraternity together, or if it was physically one of his brothers that was another son of his parents, but that person is not named. And to give a name, especially in the ancient world, in which he was so very well steeped, and he's right at the end of, to give a name is very significant, and she gets one. Now, Monica, at the end, she is identified, and you get this long listing of her virtues, and it's him pouring out onto the page, and you feel that it's more than just him venting. It's more than him just writing a love letter to his mom through God, but it's almost like him demanding her recognition as a saint herself. He grew up, he's writing this in a kind of tradition of writing saints' lives, and he is now suddenly casting her as a kind of, because you see this arc of her life where she started kind of corrupt, nipping a little at the wine barrel, and then becoming greater and greater and greater until the very end when she is a kind of divine figure. And he's mentioning how she is going around to their little community, all of his friends, and taking care of them and acting as a house mother and essentially serving them by bringing them further along to God, as she has done with Augustine himself. She has ushered in his conversion. And so he sees this, I think it's clear, as an act of divinity, as an act of saintliness that he is arguing needs recognition too. And I think that is where this book really hits the road, because it's about arguing humanity has dignity. It's not just the divine. It's not just the ideal, but that it's the element of the world, the element of humanity that participates in the ideal and is infused with the ideal, but that there is that element of humanity itself that deserves some recognition. You cannot put it aside. You can't just say, well, I'm going to go and be one with God. Well, no, because we are absolutely tied to our humanity, and we can't leave that aside. It's part of us. So when you get all of these ascetics who go off into the desert to, live on nothing and go into deliriums of religious ecstasy, that doesn't do anything. That doesn't share anything with the rest of humanity. That doesn't help anyone necessarily. He is arguing here, I think, that you have a very real effect when you are bringing humanity closer to God. And that's what Monica does. That's what you have a sense of her purpose, a sense of her value, her worth in real terms. And she's not just anyone, she is his mother. Now, why is he writing this? At the time, yeah, he's a prominent figure in the Catholic Church, but he's not a hero, he's not a king. He is, in a sense, the first autobiography writer. And this is part of that practice. It's all one. He's saying that we are all on our own little trips towards God, and we have worth. It doesn't matter that Augustine is not a king. doesn't matter that he's not a great hero. You don't have to be Julius Caesar to write a memoir. And he is offering this as his voice in the community. He is prominent, he is all of those things, but he is just an ordinary man writing this. His voice is valid. His ordinary human voice is valid, even in the scope of all the diversity of the earth and all the unknowability of the ideal. It has value. One other thing I'll just mention. Well, the end of the book, the end ends with a couple of very philosophical chapters, which we don't need to go into right now. They can be very abstract, and they're not really for the layperson. They tend to deal disproportionately with a lot of the same themes. Genesis plays a very real part in it. The function of time comes in quite a lot, and it is connected to the earlier parts of the book, the more autobiographical parts of it. And some critics will tell you that, well, you know, the first part is about how he got to be converted, and the second one is a meditation of the practice of religion itself, of the act of worship, and these are the considerations that he would have to have, having gone through all of that. But you can see, I would argue, throughout a kind of yearning for some sort of power, some sort of capacity. He gives over all sense of agency to God, but he's always struggling for, well, how do I participate in that? What can I do? What is my role? Is everything I do just attributable to God? Do I have any responsibility within that? These themes have been bubbling out throughout, and he is sometimes self-dramatizing and over-dramatic about his actions. The pear tree, theatrical entertainments. Is this really something to feel so guilty about? And he seems quite consumed with guilt for what are essentially very minor infractions. What you have, however, is, I think, a dynamic that has been characterized well by a writer named Elaine Pagels, who writes that she sees it really as Augustine's struggle to combat a sense of helplessness with guilt. He dwells on guilt because guilt is an action. Guilt has, feeling guilty has a kind of personal responsibility to it. It is a recognition that I have some power here. And the opposite of that is to be completely helpless. And in a world where you are struggling with some notion of, well, is God all-powerful? Is there anything I can do within that? There is only power and helplessness. And the power can make you feel guilty because you are then taking part in, and you're admitting that, well, okay, Adam and Eve, if they had power, if they had true agency, then they are guilty. Then they sinned. If not, then they are not. But if you participate in humanity under this definition, you are guilty. And the opposite of that is to be completely helpless. And in this time, in this place, in that era of history where we didn't really know that much, there was, science was not a thing. Monica lived to be mid-50s, and she was a very, very old woman at that time. People were very vulnerable, And you get a sense in some of those early chapters that, even in the polite society that Augustine was moving in North Africa, it could be a little rough and tumble out there in the world. You saw bruises on people, and people could act quite irrationally. Um, the struggle for some sense of control, some sense of power, some sense of capacity in that world where you are utterly vulnerable. That is, I think, very real. And I think that's what he's really struggling with. Augustine wants to find some notion where he can feel empowered, where he has some strength in a world that is outwardly quite hostile and often quite brutal. You can't participate in divinity if you're mired in an ugly, ugly world around you. So I think this is him trying to give expression to that ambition. It's a struggle. And sometimes, by finding other people doing it, other ordinary people, not saints, not heroes, it can show us how to do it.